Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this dynamic cell formation generator in Blender. We're going to make this in geometry nodes and utilise the geometry proximity node. I'll also show you a way where we can have this effect which follows a curve path. So without further ado, let's get to it. Open up Blender, I'll select the default cube, I'm going to hit delete. I'll also select the default light and I'll delete that from the scene too. We're going to use two add-ons that come shipped with Blender. So I'm going to go to edit, preferences, and under add-ons we're going to search for node and then enable the node wrangler here. Once you've searched for that, we're going to search for extra and enable extra curve objects over here. Once you've enabled those add-ons, click this button and click save preferences, and that will ensure that the add-ons load every time you load Blender. I'll then close this window. I'll then navigate to the output tab over here and I'm going to change my frame rate to 30 FPS. I'll also enable render region. I'll then go to the render settings over here and I'm going to change it from Eevee to cycles. I'll also change my device type from CPU to GPU. Under the sampling section where it says lights, I'll expand these options. I'm going to disable light tree. I'll also expand the light paths options down here. I'll scroll down and I'm going to disable reflective and refractive caustics. I'll navigate to the bottom left of my 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'll left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to the timeline. In my timeline, I'm going to change the end frame to 120 frames. I'll hover my cursor in my timeline. I'm going to hit N to hide the end panel. I'll also click home and that will center the timeline to my view. I'll take my cursor into the 3D viewport. I'll hit Shift A, we'll go curve, we'll choose spirals and I'm going to select Archimedean. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left and expand the curve spirals options down here. I'm going to increase the turns to 4 and I'll increase the height to, let's say, 1. I'll just collapse these options here. I'm going to tab out of edit mode. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate that spiral. I'll hit escape to snap it back in its original position. I'll then navigate into my outliner over here. And for the first spiral, I'm going to rename this to Spiral A. And for the second spiral, I'm going to rename this to Spiral B. I'm going to click this button up here and I'll enable all of these filters. I'll then click the eye icon for Spiral B and hide it from the viewport. I'll select Spiral A in my 3D viewport. I'll then navigate to my Curve Data tab over here. I'll expand the geometry options and under bevel, I'm going to increase the depth to, let's say, 0.2. I'll then navigate to my outliner. I'm going to hide Spiral A from the viewport and unhide Spiral B. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to go empty and I'm going to choose sphere, and with the empty data tab selected over here I'm going to decrease the size to, let's say, 0.25. I'll then navigate to my constraints tab. I'll then click add constraint and we'll select follow path. I'm going to click this eyedropper here and we'll choose this spiral B. I'll go to my constraints tab and I'll enable follow curve. I'll then click animate path, and now if I was to hit play you can see that the empty is following the spiral curve, but it continues up and we don't want that. So we're going to select our curve object. We'll then go to the curve data tab over here. I'm going to scroll down until I see path animation. We'll expand these options down here and we'll set the frames to 120 because we've got 120 frames on our timeline. Now if I was to hit play you should see that the empty object is following the curve spiral and it should stop at the end on the last frame. Excellent. I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'll just navigate to my outliner and I'll re-enable the Spiral A for the viewport. I'll navigate to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'll then left click and drag up and that will open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to Geometry Node Editor. I'm going to select Spiral A in my Geometry Node Editor. I'm going to click New and I'll rename it to Dynamic Hex Cells. I'll also click N to hide the end panel. And I'm going to zoom in. I'll just give us a bit more room. I'm just going to hit play so this empty object appears near the front. Hit play and I'll stop it around there. Okay, I'll then reselect Spiral A. I'll just zoom in to my 3D viewport. To start this node tree off, we're going to create a system where we can extrude individual cells. So in the node editor, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for subdivision surface and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for triangulate. And I'll pop that in between there. I'm going to change it from shortest path to beauty. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for dual and we'll add a dual mesh in between there. And now you can see we're getting these individual cells appear. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for extrude and we'll choose extrude mesh and I'll pop that after the dual mesh node. Obviously the extrusions are way too much at the moment, so I'll just drag this up here. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random, and we'll choose random value, and I'll pop that there. I'll then connect the value socket from the random value into the offset of the extrude mesh. I'll set a maximum distance of 0.05, and maybe I'll set a minimum distance of 0.025. I want to scale the top faces of these extrusions, so I'll just drag my node tree across there. I'll hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for scale, and we'll choose scale elements, and I'll pop that in between there. If I was to adjust this scale factor here, you can see it scales the entire mesh. We don't want that. We just want to scale the top faces of the extrusions. And luckily for us, this extrude mesh has this top mask here. So I'm going to connect this top mask into the selection socket of the scale elements node. And now if we adjust this scale factor here, you can see that only the top faces of the extrusions are scaled. Excellent. I don't want all the top faces of the extrusions to have the same scale. So to randomize this, I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for random, and we'll choose random value, and I'll pop that down here. I'll then connect this value socket from the random value into the scale socket of this scale elements node. I'll then set the minimum factor to 0.95 and the maximum factor to 0.85. Okay, we're making progress. Before we move on, I'll just show you the function of this subdivision surface. If I decrease the level, we have less cells, and if I increase the level, we have more cells. So just for now, I'm going to set this to level 1. The next step is to use this empty object as a proximity object to drive the scaling of the effect. So with spiral A selected, I'll navigate to my outliner, and I'm going to drag this empty object into the geometry node editor. I'll just zoom out just to give us a bit more room. Maybe I'll bring it over here. Shift A, and I'm going to search for mesh line, and I'll pop that there. I'm going to change the count to 1, and I'll connect the location socket from the object info into the start location of the mesh line. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for geometry proximity, and I'll pop that there. I'm going to change it from faces to points. I'll then connect the mesh socket from the mesh line into the geometry socket of the geometry proximity. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'll search for delete, and we choose delete geometry, and I'll pop that after the scale elements node. Shift A, search for not, and we'll choose boolean math not, and I'll pop that down here. I'll then connect the boolean socket to the selection socket of the delete geometry node. Shift A, and search for map, and we choose map range, and I'll pop that down here. I'll then connect the distance socket from the geometry proximity into the value socket of the map range node. I'll plug the result from the map range node into the boolean socket of the not node. From min, I'm going to set to 0.6. From max, I'm going to set to 0. To min, I'm going to set to 0. And to max, I'm going to set to 1. I'll navigate to my map range node and increase the from minimum, and you can see that increases the selection. But if we go too far, you can see too much of the geometry is selected, so the proximity of the empty object here is affecting the spiral up here, and we don't want that. So I found a sweet spot of 0.6, and that's just for this particular setup. So now we need to join the original geometry in this node tree. That's easy enough. So I'll just zoom out, I'll box select the subdivision surface and the group input. I'll just hit G, and I'll drag these across over to here. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for set shade smooth, and I'll pop that down here. I'll then connect the subdivision surface into the geometry socket of the set shade smooth node. I'll select this node. I'm going to hit G, and I'm going to bring it over to round about there. I'll then hold down Shift, right click and drag, and that will add a control point here. I'll hit G, just bring this down to round about there. Hold down Shift, right click and drag, add another control point. I'm going to hit G, and I'm going to bring this down to round about there. And that's just so we can see where it's going. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for join, and we choose join geometry, and we'll pop that at the end there. I'll then connect the set shade smooth into the bottom socket of the join geometry node. And now we've got our original spiral back. Excellent. I'll navigate to my material tab over here. I'm going to click new, and we'll rename this material to black. I'll click this plus button to add a new slot. I'll click new to add a new material, and we'll rename this to gold. In my node tree, I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for set, and we'll choose set material, and I'll pop that in between the scale elements node and the delete geometry node. And with the set material node selected, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop that in between the set shade smooth and the join geometry node. And for this top set material, we're going to set this to black, and for this bottom set material, we'll set this to gold. So I'm just going to drag my nodes all the way across over to here until I see this subdivision surface, and I'm going to increase this to, let's say, level 2. I'll box select these 3 nodes here, so that's the object info, mesh line and geometry proximity. I'll hit G just to bring them across over to here. Shift A, and I'll search for map and we choose map range node. I'll pop that there. I'll then plug the distance socket into the value socket of this map range node, and the result from this map range node into the minimum value of this random value node. For the from min factor, I'm going to set this to 0.5. From max, I'm going to set to 0. To min, I'll set to 0. And the to max, I'm going to set to 0.05. And with the map range node selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl Shift D, and that will duplicate the node whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. I'll then plug the result from this node into the max factor of this random value node. For this one, I'm going to set the from min to 0.6, and I'll set the to max to 0.1. And now you can see that the extrusion scale has a fall off, which is relative to the proximity object. We can now use these two map range nodes to increase or decrease the effect. So for example, with this random value node, which is the offset scale for the extrusions, so the maximum extrusions will be controlled by this map range node. So we can increase the extrusion amount, and we can change the fall off of that extrusion amount. And the same goes for the minimum. I'll just click Ctrl Z to undo that, and I'm going to keep it with these values here. Maybe I can expose a couple of these settings for my modifier stack over here. So in my node tree, I'm just going to zoom out. I'm going to grab this group input node, and with my object info, I'm going to connect this socket to an empty socket on my group input. And that means we can change our proximity object on the fly. So in my geometry node editor, I'm going to hit N to open up the N panel. I'm going to ensure that I've got this group tab selected. I'll then select that object socket, and I'll rename it to proximity object. And we know that in our modifiers, we can change the proximity object on the fly. Maybe I want to expose the material sockets, so we can change the materials on the fly. And instead of plugging them into this group input node, I'm going to add another group input node, which is basically a duplicate of this one. It will be the same thing. So I'll navigate over to where it says set material. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for group, and I'll choose group input, and I'll pop that there. I'll then connect this top set material into the bottom socket of this group input node. And with the group input node selected, I'm going to hit Shift D, and I'll drag it down to here. I'll then connect this material socket into the bottom socket of the group input node. I'll navigate to my N panel, and for the top material, I'll rename this to material A, and for the bottom material, I'm going to rename this to material B. So with this group input node selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl H, and that will hide any unused sockets. I'll do the same for this group input node, Ctrl H, hide any unused sockets. I'll do the same for this group input node, Ctrl H. Maybe I want to expose the values for the maximum extrusion and the maximum fall off. So I'll hit Shift A, and I'll search for group, and I'll choose group input, and I'll pop this down here. I'm going to connect the from minimum to the bottom socket of the group input, and the to maximum to the bottom socket of the group input. And with the group input selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl H to hide any unused sockets. I'll navigate to the N panel. I'm going to scroll down. I'll then double click the from minimum, and I'll rename this to extrusion fall off. I'll then double click to max, and I'll rename this to extrusion amount. I'll then select extrusion fall off, and under structure type, I'm going to set this to single. And for the extrusion amount, I'm also going to set the structure type to single. And now we can change the extrusion amount and the extrusion fall off using these values on our modifier. Excellent. I want to expose one more value into the modifier over here. So I'm going to take this group input node. I'll hit Ctrl H to unhide all the sockets. I'll then connect this level socket from the subdivision surface into the bottom socket of the group input. And with the group input selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl H to hide all the unused sockets. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel. I'm going to scroll down, and where it says level, I'm going to rename this to subdiv level, and I'm going to drag that above the extrude fall off. And now on our geometry node modifier, we can change the subdiv level on the fly. Excellent. I'm going to keep it set to 3. In my geometry node window, I'm going to hit N to hide the N panel. In the geometry node window, I'm going to hit Control Space, just so you can see the node structure. Of course, you can follow the same workflow with these group inputs to expose any other values from this node tree. Control Space. Before we move on, it's a good idea to save your project. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save my project as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then click Save As. I'm going to change this window from geometry nodes to the shader editor. I'll then select slot 1, which is black. I'm going to go into material preview. I'll then change the base color to black. I've got the materials the wrong way round. So if I navigate to my modifier tab over here, under material A, I'm going to set this to gold. And for material B, I'm going to set this to black. And with the black material selected, I'm going to go to my base color and I'm going to bring the value down to, let's say, 0.025. I'll also change it to 100% metallic. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go texture and I'll choose noise texture. I'll pop that over here. I'm going to change it from 3D to 4D. And with the noise texture selected, I'm going to hit Control T, and that will add a texture coordinate and a mapping node. I'm going to change the coordinates from generated to object. I'll increase the detail to 8, and I'll increase the roughness to 0.75. I'll then connect the factor from the noise texture into the roughness socket of the principal BSDF. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go converter, and I'll choose color ramp, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then set the position of the black flag to 0.35 and I'll set the position of the white flag to, let's say, 0.65. For this black flag, I'll click the color swatch and I'll increase the value to, let's say, 0.05. And for this white flag, I'm going to decrease the value to, let's say, 0.75. And in the shader editor, where it says slot 1, I'm going to change this to gold. And for the base color, I want to change this to gold. And the hex value for gold is hash FFD700. I'll then hit enter. I'm going to change it to 100% metallic and I'll decrease the roughness to 0.124. I'll set up the camera now, so I'm going to decrease my shader editor window, and with the spiral A selected, I'm going to hit numpad 1, numpad period, and that will center the camera to the object. I'll then hit Control Alt numpad 0, and that will align my camera to the 3D viewport. I'll then select my camera. I'm going to go to my object data tab over here. I'm going to set the X location to 0. Before I adjust the other values, I'm just going to go to my camera data tab over here, and I'm going to increase the focal length to, let's say, 70mm. I'll just hit numpad 1 to go into front view. So we know that this spiral is 1, 2, 3, 4 meters high. So therefore, if I hit numpad 0 and with your camera selected, go to the object data tab over here, our camera should be 2 meters high. And now all we have to do is adjust this Y value. So I'm going to skip to frame 1. I'm going to ensure that none of this gold is in the camera view. I'll then skip to the last frame. Again, we're going to ensure that the gold isn't in the camera view. So now I can drag my camera out a bit on the Y-axis. I'll skip back to frame 1. It's going to be in the camera view slightly there. So maybe I can bring it up on the Z-axis to round about there. I'll then skip to the last frame, just ensure that there's no gold in the camera view. In fact, I'm going to scrub my timeline so it comes in view there. So maybe we can actually zoom out slightly. Maybe I'll go for, let's say, minus 11.5 meters. Again, I'm going to skip back to frame 1. Just ensure there's no gold in the scene. I'll just select the spiral A object. I'm going to go to my modifiers and I'll decrease the subdivision level to 1, just so I've got real-time playback. I'll just hit play. Okay, excellent. I'll increase the subdivision levels to 3. So the next step is lighting. So I'm going to go to rendered view over here. I'll then navigate to my world tab down here. And I'll decrease the strength to 0. So I'm going to increase my shader editor window and I'll change this from object to world. And with my background selected, I'm going to hit Control T. And that should add a texture coordinate, mapping and an environment texture node. I'll then click open, navigate to an HDRI. If you haven't got any HDRs, you can download some from Polyhaven for free. So visit this website, polyhaven.com, hover over assets, go to HDRIs, and then select an HDRI of your choosing. So I might go for outdoor chapel, for example. I'll select this, select your resolution. So you can go from 1K to 20K for this particular HDR. You can then choose your file format, HDR or EXR, and then click download. I've already got some saved in my computer. So I'm going to go for Abandoned Hall, which is a 16K version of this one here. I'll then click open image. I'm going to set the strength to 1. I don't want to see the HDR in my render, so I'm going to go to my render tab. I'll then scroll down until I see film. I'll expand these options and I'll enable transparent. I might want to add a backplate in my scene, so I'm just going to go to viewport shading over here. I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go mesh and I'll choose plane. I'll tab into edit mode. I'll hit S4, hit enter. Maybe S2, hit enter. RX90, I'll hit enter, and then I'll tab out of edit mode. I'll hit numpad 3 to go into side view. I'll just toggle on wireframe view. I'll hit G, Y, and I'm going to bring this across over to around about there. Numpad 0 to go into camera view. Toggle on rendered view. And with that plane selected, I'm going to navigate to my shader editor. I'm going to change it from world to object. I'll click new. I'll rename this object to backplane. I'll then select the base color and I'm just going to tone this down to something around about there perhaps. Maybe I'll increase the roughness to 100% rough. Maybe I can increase the brightness. I think I can make it a bit smaller so we get a bit more of the light from the environment. So I'm just going to hit S just to scale it in. I hit G, Z, just bring it up, S, Z, scale it down, G, Z, to around about there. I'll then hit Control A and apply the scale. So one final step, I want a bit of depth of field on this. So I'm going to select my camera, I'll navigate to my camera settings down here, I'll enable depth of field, and the object I want to focus on will be the empty object, which is driving this effect here. So for the focus on object, I'll click in here and I'll select that empty object. I'll then increase my blades to 16. I'm going to decrease the f-stop to 0.1 just for the minute, so that's quite a heavy depth of field we've got going on there. So maybe I'll increase this to, let's say, 0.3, possibly 0.4. I'll navigate to my render settings over here. My noise threshold is going to be set to 0.01. And for my max samples, just for a test frame, I'm going to set this to 1024. I'll then select my output tab over here, navigate to this file icon over here, choose the file location where you want to save your image sequence, and then click accept. Choose the file format of your choice. If you're going with PNG, go with RGB with a color depth of 8-bit or 16-bit, should be absolutely fine. I'm going to change my file format to OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will decrease my file size whilst increasing dynamic range for post-production. I'll now navigate to the render tab over here. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to increase the performance options down here, and where it says final render, I'm going to enable persistent data, and that will ensure that it doesn't have to load the HDR on every frame, and that will decrease the build time for every frame. I'll scroll all the way up to the top. I'll then toggle on material preview. I'm going to hit Control S to save the project, and then it's simply a case of hitting Control F12, and that will render out your image sequence. Join me on Patreon as a free member, and you'll have access to this Blender file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.